how are we caring for the poor and the vulnerable among us? Right? It's one thing we're called to do as followers of Jesus. That's why the Apostle Paul, when he first becomes a Christian and he first gets into church leadership, he's like, what do I do? So he goes to Peter and John and James and the other leaders in Jerusalem and says, what should I do? And he actually describes what they tell him to do in Galatians chapter 2. Paul says this, when James and Cephas, that meaning Peter, and John, those recognized as pillars, acknowledged the grace that had been given to me, they gave me the right hand of fellowship to me and to Barnabas, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. He says, all right, let's divide and conquer. Paul says, I'll preach the gospel to the Gentiles. You guys go to the Jews. And then in verse 10, it says this, they asked only. Right? There was just one stipulation they had for me. There was just one thing they made sure that I didn't forget. They asked only that we would remember the poor, which I made every effort to do. He said, Paul, right, when you go out and preach, when you go out and start new churches, don't just go out and reach people who have means that can support your ministry. Go out and serve the poor. And so what does that look like for us today? Well, how do we do that today? I like thinking of it this way. We empower people's potential instead of enabling their problems. Yes, we empower their potential instead of enabling their problems. Because for many years, our government and many Christian charities, in the desire to help people, we've actually just created cycles of dependency and robbed people of their dignity. Right? We've just given out silver and gold, made people dependent on our charity, and made us feel really good about helping the poor, but made other people feel inferior as if they're not as good as us. But God says that's not what you do as a church. That's not what you do as a follower of Jesus to serve the poor. He says don't give handouts, give hand-ups. And that's what Peter and John did, right? What did they do? They knelt down. They reached down and they picked him up to help him get back on his feet. And that's what we do through our Passion for Community ministry. Right? We are helping people that are in a very vulnerable time in their life. They're working with the county of Fairfax to get into an apartment, to get jobs, working with social workers, and we're there at that time in their moment to just say, hey, we see you and we're here to support you. Right? This is what our friend Mike Fricks does. And many of you know Mike Fricks. Several years ago, he said, as a follower of Jesus, how do I serve the poor and the vulnerable among me? He started a nonprofit called Make a Difference Nova, and he would just go out to the streets and meet people who are living on the streets and said, hey, would you be willing to walk with me? He says, I could train you in some job skills, and I can help you fill out job applications, and I can help you find an apartment, and I can help you even pay some initial bills so you can get back on your feet. And that's what he's been doing. He says, Sean, I'm not giving people a handout. I'm giving them a hand up. I'm helping them get back on their feet and survive. That's why him and Dan and Lynn Hike recently have started their Lazarus Motor Works ministry, helping families, struggling families in our area, secure reliable vehicles so that they can get to and from work. Right? If you're like, man, I think God's calling me to care for the poor, could you connect with Mike? Could you connect with Dan and Lynn? Could you support their ministry? If you have a car that you're like, I don't know what to do with this car, I got to get rid of it, you could donate it to Lazarus Motor Works and could go help a family that's in need. Right? This is how God has called us to care for the poor and the vulnerable among us. We see this all the way back in the Old Testament. Right? When God's leading the Israelites into the promised land, he says, people, in a matter of years, you are going to have some resources. Right? You're going to have some land. But he says, never forget that you were once slaves in Egypt. He says, never forget you were once poor and vulnerable. So take care of those who are poor and vulnerable among you. Here's a couple passages where he explicitly lays out basically his welfare system for the nation of Israel. Here's Leviticus 23:22. He says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap all the way to the edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the resident alien. I am the Lord your God. Right? He says, just don't harvest it all. Don't harvest the edges. Don't harvest the corners. Leave that for the poor. Deuteronomy 24:20-21, he says, and when you knock down the fruit from your olive tree, do not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the resident alien, right, the refugee, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. What remains will be for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. What is he saying? He is saying, don't give handouts, give hand-ups. He doesn't say, okay, collect everything so that you have a lot, and then you can just give some of what you have to the poor. No, he says, leave some stuff unharvested so that those that are in need can work, right? So that they can have an opportunity to provide for themselves, so that you don't rob them of their dignity and you don't feel all of a sudden superior to them. But walk with them. Help them get back on their feet. So that's how we serve the poor. Yes, we empower potential. We don't enable problems.